Jesus rebukes the wind with the exact same word he once used to silence a demon. Say that slowly, because Mark doesn't slow down to explain it. Earlier in his gospel, when an unclean spirit cries out in a synagogue, Jesus turns and says one sharp command: be muzzled. Chapters later, standing in a swamped boat in the middle of a lake, he turns to the wind and the waves and says the same thing. Same verb, same tone of confrontation. Not a prayer, not a request, a rebuke, the kind you'd give to something that doesn't belong. Which raises a question most readings of this story never ask. What if the storm wasn't just weather? And underneath that question sits an even stranger detail, the fact that Jesus was asleep for all of it. Not anxious, not alert, not gripping the side of the boat like everyone else. Asleep, on a cushion, through what may have been the most violent moment his disciples had ever experienced on that water. A man who can sleep through chaos and then wake up and speak to it like an intruder that's overstayed its welcome, that's not just a nature miracle, that's something else. And Mark, if you know where to look, tells you exactly what. To understand what Mark is doing, you have to stand where he stood, not in a church, but on a lake. The year is somewhere in the late 20s AD. Galilee belongs, on paper, to Herod Antipas, not a king exactly, but a tetrarch, a Roman-approved ruler governing a small slice of his father's old kingdom, answering to an emperor in Rome he will never meet. It's a region caught between worlds. Jewish villages dot the western shore. Just across the water, on the eastern side, sit the cities of the Decapolis. Greek-speaking, Gentile, foreign. A cluster of 10 cities built and shaped by Hellenistic culture long before Rome arrived to inherit them. The lake itself is the border. To cross it is not just to travel, it's to leave one world and enter another. The lake has a name that oversells it. Everyone calls it a sea, the Sea of Galilee. But it's a lake, freshwater, sitting nearly 700 feet below sea level in a long crack in the earth, called the Jordan Rift Valley. And that low, bowl-shaped basin is exactly what makes it dangerous. Cold air drops off the surrounding hills, some of them rising nearly 2,000 feet, and collides with the warm, humid air sitting over the water. When that happens, the lake doesn't build a storm the way an ocean does, slowly, with warning. It detonates one. Fishermen who have worked these waters their whole lives can be caught inside a squall within minutes, with no horizon to watch it coming from, no gathering clouds to read in advance. One moment the surface is glass, the next it isn't, which is who's in this boat. Several of the men rowing through the wind that evening are not passengers, they are professionals. Peter, Andrew, James, John, men who grew up on this water, who make their living reading it, whose families likely fished it for generations before them. Fishing on Galilee in this period was not a casual trade. It required capital, boats, nets, crew, a working knowledge of the lake's moods, and it operated under licenses and taxes tied to Herod's administration. These were not poor men adrift with nothing to lose. They were skilled tradesmen who understood risk the way any professional understands the hazards of their own work. Their fear, when it comes, will not be the fear of people unfamiliar with danger. It will be the fear of people who know exactly what they're looking at, and know exactly how this usually ends, and the boat itself is smaller than most people picture. A vessel from this world and this era, one was pulled from the mud of this very lake in 1986, after decades buried beneath it, uncovered only because a drought had lowered the water enough to expose it. Radiocarbon dating and pottery found inside placed its use somewhere between roughly 50 BC and 50 AD. Squarely within the lifetime of the people in this story. It measured about 27 feet long and 7.5 feet wide, open, wooden, built with a shallow, flat-bottomed hull designed for working close to shore, not for surviving open water in a genuine tempest. There is no claim that this specific boat carried Jesus and his disciples. Historians are careful about that. But it tells us, with real confidence, exactly what kind of vessel these men were in. Modest, exposed, and never designed for what was about to happen to it. Earlier that same day, this boat, or one just like it, had been a stage, not a lifeboat. Jesus had been teaching from it, sitting just off the shore, using the water as distance between himself and the crowd pressing in to hear him, telling story after story about a kingdom that starts small and hidden and grows in ways no one expects. A seed scattered on soil, a lamp placed under a basket instead of a stand, a mustard seed no bigger than a speck that becomes, eventually, something birds nest in. Then, as evening falls, he says something almost startlingly plain, not a parable this time, a decision. Let us go across to the other side. That's it. No dramatic build-up, just a direction and a destination, the far shore, Gentile territory, the world on the other side of the water most of his Jewish listeners would never have had reason to visit. The crossing isn't something that happens to Jesus. It's something he chooses, spoken as plainly as any instruction he gives all day. They leave the crowd behind, other boats follow, and somewhere out on the water, with the shore no longer in sight, the wind changes. This is the world Mark is asking you to stand inside, a real lake with a documented, violent temperament, a real crew of men who know better than to panic over nothing, a real wooden boat too small for what's coming, and a teacher who has just spoken 8 words that put all of them in the middle of it, on purpose, headed somewhere none of them would have chosen to go on their own. It's into this world, this specific water, this specific danger, this specific decision, that Mark drops the sentence that starts everything. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. The sentence lands hard, and then Mark does something worth noticing before you even get to the sleeping. He doesn't say a storm came and the boat rocked a little. He says the waves were beating into the boat, and then adds a detail easy to skim past. It was already filling, not about to fill, already. By the time Mark tells you there's a problem, the problem has been happening for a while. Water is pooling around ankles. The weight of it is starting to drag at the hull. This isn't the opening moment of the danger. It's the middle of it, and Mark has fast-forwarded you straight into the worst part. Think about what that means for the men doing the rowing. These are not tourists misreading a little chop. These are professionals, watching a boat they know intimately take on water at a rate they know is not survivable indefinitely. There's no ambiguity in their minds about what's happening. The only ambiguity left is how much time they have. And it's precisely here, water rising, hands bailing, wind screaming, that Mark tells you where Jesus is. He was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. One sentence, almost tossed in, the way you'd mention a small, strange fact in passing. But slow down on it, because this detail belongs to Mark alone. Matthew and Luke don't include it. And when a detail like this survives in only one account, historians and scholars often read it as the fingerprint of an eyewitness memory, the kind of small, oddly specific thing you only include if you were actually there and it stuck with you. Someone remembered exactly where he was sitting, exactly what he was resting on, a cushion, likely nothing more than a helmsman's seat pad or a sack used as ballast, the ordinary furniture of a working fishing boat, not a luxury item brought along for comfort. Picture it plainly. Water is now moving across the floor of the boat. Men are shouting over each other and over the wind, and somewhere in the middle of that noise, a grown man is unconscious enough not to notice water reaching his feet. That's not just tired. Tiredness gets you through a rocking boat. Tiredness doesn't sleep through a swamping. So here's the tension the text quietly hands you and never resolves out loud. Either Jesus was so exhausted that even a life-threatening flood couldn't wake him, which raises real, uncomfortable questions about awareness and care, or something else was happening in that sleep, something the disciples, gripping the sides of a sinking boat, had no way yet to understand. They find out what they think about it a moment later, and the word they choose is worth sitting with.
Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?
Not Lord. Not Son of God, teacher. Didaskalos, the ordinary word for a rabbi, an instructor, someone you follow to learn from, not someone you'd expect to command a sea. It's the correct word for who they think is in the boat with them, a respected teacher, a man worth following. Not yet, in their minds, in this moment, anyone with authority over wind and water. And notice the accusation folded inside that title. Do you not care? Not, can you help? Not, do something. Do you not care? As if the sleep itself is the evidence. As if a caring teacher would at least be awake and afraid with them. Their fear isn't only about the storm anymore. It's curdled into something closer to abandonment. The one detail they cannot make sense of, the sleep, has become, in their minds, proof of indifference. This is where the story could have gone in an entirely ordinary direction. Jesus wakes up, grabs an oar, helps bail, encourages the men, and the boat somehow makes it to shore, through skill and grit and a break in the weather. That would still be a good story. It would still be a story about presence in fear. But that isn't what happens next. And the way Mark describes what happens next is where this stops being an ordinary story about a scary boat ride. He awoke and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Rebuked, not calmed, not soothed, not prayed over. In the Greek, epitimao, a word carrying real force, the language of confrontation, not comfort. And the command itself, pephimoso, comes from a root meaning to muzzle, the same image you'd use for silencing an animal, or, as Mark's own gospel has already shown you, silencing something that has no right to keep speaking. Because this is not the first time Mark has used this word. Go back 3 chapters. A man in a synagogue, possessed by an unclean spirit, cries out, and Jesus turns to it and says one sharp command, "Be muzzled." Same verb, same posture. Same tone of a person confronting something out of place and ordering it to stop. Now Jesus turns, not to a spirit in a synagogue, but to wind and water in the middle of a lake, and says, in effect, the same thing. That is not a coincidence Mark leaves lying around by accident. Repetition like this, in a text this economical with its words, tends to be doing work, and the work it does here is this. Mark is quietly asking you to notice that the authority on display in this boat belongs to the same category Jesus has already shown you once before. Not persuasion, not petition, but command. Whatever this storm actually was, Jesus does not negotiate with it. He speaks to it the way you speak to something required to obey. This is worth being careful about, because it's a place where popular teaching often overreaches. Mark never says outright that the storm was demonic. Scholars are genuinely divided on how far to press this connection. Some see the shared vocabulary as strong evidence that Mark wants readers to sense a spiritual confrontation happening beneath the surface of the water. Others see it as Mark simply reusing forceful, familiar language because it fit the scene, without intending a direct claim about the storm's origin. Both readings take the text seriously. What can be said with more confidence is narrower and arguably more interesting. Whatever this storm was, the vocabulary used to end it is the vocabulary of authority over something disordered, not the vocabulary of a man managing weather. To understand how strange that authority actually was to a Jewish audience listening to this story for the first time, it helps to know what the sea already meant to them, long before this boat ever left the shore. In the poetry and prophetic literature these disciples would have grown up hearing, the sea is rarely just water. It carries weight as a symbol of chaos, the raw, untamed deep that existed before the world had order, the same waters described in the opening lines of Genesis, formless and dark, over which the Spirit hovered before God spoke light and structure into being. The sea, in this imagination, is the thing that resists order, and Scripture is careful, almost insistent, about who alone has authority over it. In the book of Job, God himself describes setting limits on the sea at creation, closing it in with doors, telling it, in effect, "This far you may come, and no farther. Here your proud waves must stop." It's framed as one of the clearest proofs of who God is, spoken by God to Job as evidence no human could possibly claim for themselves. And in the Psalms, the sailor's prayer is answered the same way, a psalm describing men on a ship, reeling and staggering like drunken men in a storm, crying out to the Lord, who then made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Different waters, same pattern. The sea does not answer to strength or skill or bravery. In this tradition, it answers to exactly one voice, which means when Jesus stands in a swamped fishing boat and speaks 2 words to the wind and the waves, and they obey, he is stepping into a role the Hebrew Scriptures had, for centuries, reserved for God alone, not claiming a new kind of power invented for the occasion, occupying a seat that was never, in Israel's own texts, available to anyone else. If you've never noticed that before, that the word Jesus uses on a storm is the same word he uses on a demon, and that the authority he's claiming over the sea belongs to a category the Hebrew Scriptures had never once given to a human being, you're seeing something most readings of this passage walk right past. That's the kind of detail this channel exists to slow down and actually sit with, instead of skimming past on the way to the moral of the story. If that connection is starting to shift how you read this scene, it's worth sticking around for what comes next, because the identical verb isn't actually the strangest thing in this passage. There's an older story, one nearly every person in that boat would have grown up hearing, where a man is also found asleep, in a boat, in a storm that should have killed everyone on board. And in that story, the sleeping man is not the hero. He's the reason the storm is happening at all. To understand why the disciples' fear runs so deep, and why their question carries the weight it does, you have to go back roughly 7 centuries before this boat ever left the shore. There is another story in Scripture about a man asleep in a ship during a storm, capable of killing everyone aboard. It's a story most of the men in this boat would have known since childhood, read aloud in the synagogue, told around the same fires where they learned the Psalms and the law, the book of Jonah. Here is how it opens. A prophet named Jonah has been told by God to go one direction, toward Nineveh, a city he has every reason to resent, and instead boards a ship sailing the opposite way, toward Tarshish, running from the assignment he's been given. A violent storm comes up on the sea, fierce enough that the ship itself, the text says, threatened to break apart. The sailors, experienced men who know this water, are terrified, so terrified they start throwing cargo overboard just to survive, and each one begins crying out to his own God, hoping something, anything, will answer. And in the middle of all of it, the text tells us exactly where Jonah is. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. Sit with that phrasing, fast asleep, not dozing, not resting his eyes, deeply, thoroughly unconscious, while the ship is being torn apart around him and men are hurling possessions into the sea in a last effort to stay afloat. The captain finds him and asks almost the identical question that will echo across these same waters centuries later. What do you mean, sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps he will give a thought to us, that we may not perish. Different words, same disbelief. How can you possibly be asleep right now? Notice, too, what happens after. The sailors eventually cast lots to find out who has brought this disaster on them, and the lot falls on Jonah. He confesses, tells them exactly who he is and exactly what he's running from. And even then, his solution is not to intercede for the ship, not to pray it calm, not to speak any word of authority over the water at all. His solution is his own removal. Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, he tells them, so it will quiet down for you. The storm does not end because Jonah does something. It ends because Jonah is taken out of the boat. Now hold that image next to the one you already have. A boat, a deadly storm, experienced sailors in genuine danger, a man asleep below deck while it happens, someone shaking him awake, stunned that sleep was even possible. The shape is almost identical. And that's not something later readers invented to make a clever point. It's the kind of pattern the gospel writers and their earliest Jewish audiences were trained their whole lives to notice, because Scripture had taught them to read this way, story echoing story, one scene answering another across centuries of the same unfolding narrative. But here's where the comparison earns its weight, because the echo by itself isn't the point. The echo exists to set up the difference, and the difference is where everything turns. In Jonah's story, the sleeping man is the problem. Jonah is asleep because he is fleeing God's call, running as far from obedience as a ship can carry him, and his sleep looks almost like a kind of numbness, the exhaustion of a man trying not to feel the weight of what he's avoiding. The storm doesn't stop because Jonah wakes up and does something heroic. It stops because the sailors, at Jonah's own instruction, physically throw him into the sea. The storm ends when the disobedient man is removed from the boat. Now look again at the boat on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is also asleep during a deadly storm. But he is not running from where God sent him. He said it himself just hours earlier. Let us go across to the other side. He is asleep in the middle of doing exactly what he was sent to do, sailing directly toward the very assignment ahead of him. And when the storm threatens to end that mission before it starts, the resolution is not removal. Nobody throws Jesus overboard to save the ship. He simply speaks. 2 words, and the sea that once required a man's death to be silenced now obeys a man's voice instead. Same setting, same danger, same stunned question thrown at a sleeping man, and 2 completely opposite reasons why the sleep was even possible in the first place. Jonah could sleep because he had stopped caring where the ship was headed. Jesus could sleep because he already knew exactly where it was headed, and he was utterly at peace with it. That's the peace the peaceful nap version of this story usually misses entirely. It isn't just that Jesus was calm. It's that his calm is the mirror image of the last time Scripture told a story shaped exactly like this one, and anyone listening in the first century, steeped in Jonah the way these men were, would have felt that contrast the moment they heard the word asleep in a boat, the way you'd feel it today if a story began. And then, like Jonah, he went below deck and fell asleep. This is worth being honest about. Nowhere does Mark say outright, this is the anti-Jonah story. He doesn't cite the book by name inside this passage. The connection is a pattern careful readers and scholars have long recognized in the shared shape of the 2 accounts, not a direct quotation Mark points to and explains for you. But patterns like this, once seen, are difficult to unsee, because the details lining up are too specific to be coincidence. The boat, the storm, the sleep, the stunned question, the deadly danger, echoing so closely that the differences become the loudest part of the story. And it's worth noting that Jesus himself, later in his ministry, explicitly points back to Jonah as a sign connected to his own identity and mission, which doesn't prove Mark had this exact echo in mind while writing chapter 4, but it does show that the comparison between Jesus and Jonah was already alive in how Jesus talked about himself, not something invented centuries later by commentators looking for connections. And that's the piece that reframes everything the verse spine has been building toward. The sleep was never the absence of concern. It was the evidence of a man fully at rest inside his own obedience, so at rest that even a swamping boat couldn't disturb it, while the very next thing he does is speak to the chaos with the same authority Scripture has always reserved for God alone. Which leaves one question still sitting unanswered in the boat. If the sleep was peace and the rebuke was authority, what did the men in that boat actually see when they put those 2 things together? Pull the camera back and look at the whole boat at once, a lake that turns violent without warning. A crew who know its moods better than anyone alive, a vessel small enough to feel every wave, and in the stern, a man asleep on a cushion, undisturbed by water already rising around him. That was never just exhaustion. Behind him, if you knew where to look, stood another boat, centuries older, another storm, another sleeping man. A prophet running the wrong direction, so far from obedience that he could sleep through his own unraveling. That sleeper had to be thrown into the sea before the storm would release the ship. This sleeper didn't need removing. He was already going exactly where he'd said he would go. Let us cross to the other side. Not a detour, a decision, made hours before the wind ever turned, which means the peace in that boat wasn't the peace of a man unaware of the danger. It was the peace of a man who had already settled the only question that mattered, long before the storm ever asked it of him. Then the waking. Then the voice. Not a prayer lifted toward heaven, a command turned toward the wind. The same word once spoken to a spirit that had no right to keep speaking, now spoken to a sea that, in Israel's own scriptures, had only ever answered to one voice. Be muzzled. And it was. Sleep, then silence. rest, then rebuke. 2 moments. One source, a teacher, they had called him, hours before. A man worth following, worth learning from, but not, in their minds, a man the wind would actually obey. By the time the water went flat and the wind went quiet, that title didn't fit anymore. Something underneath it did. The sea had heard a voice it recognized. The question is whether the men in the boat did too. There is a version of this story that doesn't need a boat at all. It's the version where you've done what you believed you were supposed to do, the obedient thing, the faithful thing, the thing that felt like following a clear direction, and the water started rising anyway. Not because you wandered off course, because you didn't. That's the part of this story that rarely gets said out loud. The storm didn't come because the disciples got in the wrong boat. It came while they were doing exactly what they'd been told to do, crossing, at his own word, toward exactly where he meant to take them. Obedience didn't prevent the storm, it sailed them straight into it. If that feels familiar, it's because most people learn this eventually, usually the hard way. That doing the right thing, the faithful thing, the thing you were fairly sure you'd been led to, it doesn't come with a guarantee of calm water. Sometimes it comes with worse water than you would have found doing nothing at all, and somewhere in that water, most people ask some version of the disciples' question, not politely, not theologically, just, "Do you not care that I am going under?" It's not usually a crisis of doctrine when someone says that. It's closer to grief. The unbearable part was never only the storm. It was the silence that seemed to be coming from the one who was supposed to be with them in it. Here's what the text actually gives back, and it isn't a tidy answer. It's a picture. The silence wasn't absence. What looked like unawareness from inside the panic was, underneath it, a peace that had already made its decision. Not because the danger wasn't real, but because obedience had already settled something the storm couldn't unsettle. That's not a promise that the water stays calm. Scripture doesn't say that here, and it would be dishonest to say it did. What it offers is smaller than that, and maybe steadier, that the presence in the boat was never determined by whether he looked awake, and that when he did finally stand up, the same voice that had been resting through the chaos turned out to be the one thing the chaos could not outlast. Most people never get to watch the wind actually stop. Most storms just eventually pass, or don't, and life goes on either way. But every so often, in the middle of asking whether anyone up front even cares that the water is rising, it's worth remembering that the sleep was never the whole story. It rarely is. He wasn't sleeping through the storm, he was resting inside the answer to it. If this is the first time you've read this passage this way, you're exactly who this channel exists for. The Scripture Project is built on the belief that the Bible rewards slow attention, that there are details like this one waiting in plain sight in nearly every book, every chapter, every familiar story we think we already know. If this study helped you see Mark 4 differently, consider passing it along to someone who's read this story 100 times and never once been shown the boat, the lake, or the word Jesus used twice. And if you want more of this kind of work, patient, careful, text first, subscribing helps this channel keep doing it. Thank you for sitting in the boat with us today.